Please can I welcome everyone to this meeting of the Licensing Subcommittee, taking place from the Walton Suite, Winchester Guildhall. Time is 2:30 p.m. My name is Councillor Derek Green, Chairperson of this particular Licensing Subcommittee. Please can I advise that all open parts of the meeting are being audio recorded and live streamed on the Council's website. In addition, a video recording of this meeting will be uploaded to the Council's YouTube channel after the meeting. Please can I also remind members to speak clearly and remember to use your microphones. Finally, please can I ask everyone to ensure that mobile phones and other electronic devices are on silent or switched off entirely. Now, moving on to the agenda for this procedure for this meeting. Do I have any disclosure of interest from members or officers, please?
None, Chairman.
Thank you. Now moving on to the agenda. Application for a new premises licence at the Stables, 31B The Square, Winchester. Report number LR554. The hearing regulations require that the hearing should take form of a discussion led by the subcommittee, and the cross-examination will not normally be allowed. We will be following the adopted procedure of these hearings, which are set out on the reverse of the agenda pack. Each party will be allowed equal maximum time to exercise their rights at the hearing. I will exercise my discretion to allow additional time if necessary, taking into account the requirement to allow all parties equal maximum time. Only those points contained in the written representation, the report and the supplementary documents can be raised. No new evidence can be considered except with the agreement of all parties. So do I have the applicant seated, please?
Yes, you do, sir. My name is Philip Day. I'm a solicitor from Lacey's in Bournemouth, and I'm here to represent the applicant company. To my right is Mr. Ollie Scratchley, who is effectively regional manager and responsible for this and other sites.
Okay, thank you. Right. Can I now introduce on my right Councillor Roger Bento, and on my left is Councillor Patrick Cunningham on the subcommittee. Can I ask all officers to introduce themselves, please?
Good afternoon, Bryony Appletree, Interim Licensing Manager for Winchester City Council.
Nathan Manley, Solicitor for Winchester City Council.
Claire Buchanan, Senior Democratic Services Officer, Minuting Meeting for Winchester City Council.
Thank you. And we have
Policing Brian Swallow, Police Licensing Officer, here representing the Chief Officer of Police.
Thank you very much. The subcommittee has read all the written comments on the application, which are included in the report. I understand that there are no parties who wish to address the subcommittee. We can only consider issues relating to the 4 licensing objectives: prevention of crime and disorder, public safety, prevention of public nuisance, and protection of children. The subcommittee will also have regard to the national guidance and the Council's licensing policy. So I'll now ask the licensing officer to introduce the report, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application for the grant of a new premises licence under Section 17 of the Licensing Act 2003, and the application is for the Stable at 31B The Square in Winchester. The premises is described in the application as a bar and restaurant. The premises does already benefit from a premises licence, It's understood that this new application seeks to retain the same operating hours and the same licensable activities, with some modifications to the conditions to reflect how the premises currently operates. The full application can be seen at pages 19 to 31 of your report bundle. One representation was received from a responsible authority, that's from PC Brian Swallow on behalf of the Chief Officer of Police. This representation relates to the licensing objectives of the prevention of crime and disorder, public safety and the prevention of public nuisance. PC Swallow and the applicant's agent, Mr. Day, have exchanged correspondence relating to the licence conditions throughout the licence consultation period and up until yesterday, I believe. Their correspondence can be seen at appendices 5, 7 and 8. Correspondence received yesterday suggests that the two parties have agreed on quite a number of conditions, but there are still some outstanding for discussion. No representations have been received from members of the public or other persons. Members are reminded that they may only take into consideration matters which relate to the 4 licensing objectives. If the subcommittee were minded to grant this application, there are a number of conditions suggested in the report itself and also in the appendices for consideration. We have our legal advisor here present to advise you on which conditions might be proportionate and to assist you with understanding which conditions have already been agreed by the parties and which are still outstanding. I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Brady. Councillor Cummings, do you have any questions? Not. Councillor Better.
Just something I noticed in both the report and in the application, that the recorded music is allowed to go on after closing hours. It must be just an area writing things in, also needs to be corrected before anything is approved.
I would refer to the applicant's agent to provide clarity on that, Councillor.
Thank you. If you look at the existing licence, you'll find a little curiously that the opening hours of the premises are not stated. So on the face of it, although they have drinking until a certain time, normally you'd expect to see opening hours for another 20 or 30 minutes beyond that. But in this case, no opening hours are actually stated. Now, I'm guessing, because I don't know, but it looks very much as if back in 2005, these premises benefited from adjustances on and off licence granted under the 64 Act. And it would also appear that it had what was known at the time as a music and dancing licence, or public entertainment licence, as is more properly known. And going along with that, it would have had the benefit of what was known as a special hours certificate as well. It would appear that back in 2005, when these premises operated very much as a nightclub, an application was made under the transition provisions to convert those old licences and certificates into a new premises licence, subject to what was called grandfather rights. In other words, if you had it before, you were entitled to keep it, and subject to the same conditions as previously applied under the regime and the Local Government Various Provisions Act, etc. It did happen from time to time that because the opening hours were stated on the licence, and the Licensing Act 2003 did away with the concept of fixed opening hours for on licences, off licences, restaurants, etc. That in this case, no opening hours were stated. It's a requirement of any application for a new licence that you do state the opening hours and that they copy across. But yes, you're entirely right, and it does seem a little incongruous that recorded music should be allowed to go on for half an hour after the apparent closing time of the premises. We have no difficulty with that possible typo being put right. Don't know how it arose, but there it is. So yes, that's a no-brainer if you're using that expression.
Thank you for that explanation.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so this is the applicant's chance now to put across their case to the licensing subcommittee, please.
Thank you very much. I'll start with a very brief history. Mr. Spratley, who has lived in Winchester during his teenage years, remembers this place as being a nightclub, and had been a nightclub for just about as long as anybody can remember. About 5 years or so ago, it was bought or acquired by the brewery Fuller's, who converted it into what it now is, the stable as a restaurant. Just over 18 months ago, the applicant company bought the company that owned all of the stable bars and restaurants that had previously ultimately been owned by Fuller's, and have been operating it ever since then. It operates very much, I described it in the application as a bar restaurant. I think more accurately as a restaurant bar. Downstairs is laid out to a total of about 50 covers, and upstairs there are approximately 75 covers. Notwithstanding the hours that are permitted on the existing licence, the reality of the situation is that the premises doesn't serve coffee or anything like that early in the morning. It opens at about 11 o'clock in the expectation of a lunchtime trade from about 12 o'clock, and then continues to provide food. And it is largely a pizza restaurant. There are other things available, but it is very much sourdough pizzas and so on. Through normally until about 10 o'clock at night, and they normally shut at 11 o'clock. Occasionally there are a few stragglers. Once in a blue moon, somebody comes along and wants to hire out part of the premises for some sort of private function, and on the rare occasions that happens, then the premises may be open beyond midnight, but it still operates. It's not a vertical drinking establishment by any stretch of the imagination. It also transpired after the premises had been acquired, we looked at the licence in more detail, that some years ago somebody had installed a servery, a bar servery on the first floor. Ceilings in this place are quite high, and there is quite a long staircase up from the ground floor to the first floor. And it's perfectly clear that that was done for convenience, so that waiters, waitresses didn't have to run up and down stairs with drinks and so on and so forth. But that's not shown on the plans. So it was necessary to make some sort of application, which is in effect a retrospective application, to have new accurate layout plans attached to the licence. At the same time, there were conversations between the stable group and the then licensing manager, who basically suggested you've got some conditions on this licence that are really nightclub type licence conditions, and which really seem to be a bit unnecessary, like having to conduct toilet checks and having to have SIA to a specified number if you're open beyond midnight. You may wish to consider making an application to get rid of those conditions, and that was my instruction to do that. It did occur to me at the time that it might be appropriate to make a minor variation application to remove conditions. However, and particularly with regard to the SIA condition, and it seemed to be that there was a not insignificant risk that the police in particular, but others as well, might raise an issue in regard to a minor variation application, in that to allow it might undermine, not necessarily would, that's not the test, might undermine one or other of the licensing objectives, specifically crime disorder. So we ruled out a minor variation. There was then a question of whether we applied to vary the existing licence or put a new licence application in. And for technical reasons, not least saving money, the decision was made to put a new licence application in. I can explain that one very briefly. If you apply to vary a licence, then you pay exactly the same fee as if you are making an application for a new licence. The procedure, to all intents and purposes, is exactly the same. You have to pay for a public notice, you have to put a blue site notice up, etc., etc. The difference being that if you vary an existing licence, then during the course of the 12 months, you have to pay an annual fee as well. If you apply for a new licence, then surrender the old, then there isn't an annual fee payable until 12 months later. And given that the rateable value of these premises is £93,000, it falls into band D, which is one of the higher ones in terms of fees. And that's why this application came about, with varied plans attached, and to a very large extent duplicating the conditions on the existing licence, which appear to have served the premises well for a long time, but with a couple of changes. Toilet checks, no, and instead of mandatory SIA conditions, to look at risk assessing that. So the very rare occasions if the premises were to be open after midnight, then there would be a requirement to consider, well, why is it open beyond midnight? What's happening? Is there anything out of the ordinary going on? Or is it just going to be some quiet function that's not cause any problem? We don't need to trouble with SIA door supervisors. And that is what we did. Mr. or our PC Swallow, beg his pardon, I'm sure you forgive me for saying this, but wasn't happy with that, and basically said, well, if you want to keep your 230 licence and so on and so forth, then you could go back to being a nightclub, and if you want rid of the nightclub conditions, then effectively you have to have restaurant conditions. What I have done, or attempted to do, was to produce this document, which I'm really sorry that you got it so late. That's entirely my fault. But to try and make sense of it all, what I've done here is to say, well, under each heading, this is what we, the applicant, proposed in the application, and just copied and pasted it from the application. This is what the police have responded with, not in quite the same order as the police response, but to put them against each particular heading, and then to effectively give a commentary with regard to the same. So if you'd be kind enough to look at the supplemental documents, this is number 2. If I can take you through these fairly quickly. And what I would like to do is to get rid of the ones that we don't have a problem with first. So if you turn the page over to page 3 of that, you'll see the prevention of crime and disorder. I proposed a CCTV condition. PC Swallow has rewritten the CCTV condition. And if that is what the police want, then I have no difficulty with that at all.
Sorry to interject. I think our councillors have the same documents, albeit printed in supplementary agenda 2. So we have different page numbers.
Right.
If you wouldn't mind referring to the one with the council logo on, that might avoid.
It's the one with page 5 at the bottom. It also has page 3 of it, doesn't
Same
it?
page, see that.
Yeah, it's page 5, prevention of crime and disorder. You'll see there in ordinary type what was proposed by me on behalf of the applicant, and then in italics what was proposed by PC Swallow. I think in reality there isn't a huge difference. Perfectly happy to go along with the police wording stated at the top of page 4. The next condition related to refusal to register and incident recording, and you can see there what was proposed in the application and then what was proposed by the police, but that only related to a refusals log. Yeah. Thank you. I have to say that with this one, I had a legal difficulty. The trouble with these things is that if somebody makes a representation suggesting that conditions be deleted, but they are simply deleted, then there is always the risk that somebody else looking at the application may have said, well, I'm perfectly happy with that as it stands because this and other conditions are there. And if you simply cross them out, then somebody who may have decided not to make a representation perhaps would have made a representation if that wasn't there. So for that reason, where the police suggest there shouldn't be a condition or there doesn't need to be a condition or whatever, what I'm proposing, and I do it here, is to say, well, keep it in, but modify it slightly in order to take account of what the police had to say. And if you look halfway down page 4, you will see in bold capitals that I've suggested that the applicant's wording be adopted, subject to the amendments in bold below. There are only 3 of them. The first being that the registers should be either written or electronic. That's not a problem. That the books should be checked, signed and dated by the DPS or a senior manager on a weekly basis, absolutely fine. And the records be retained for a period of at least 12 months, and that's absolutely fine. Then, with regard to the SIA condition, I've already mentioned that to you, the basis and the reason for that. What the police have had to say about that is that they don't think that a risk assessed condition or a condition requesting that there be a risk assessment is really of any use. It's just an empty promise. Well, with the greatest respect to PC Swallow and the Chief Officer of Police, it is a condition, and as such it is enforceable. The stable group consists altogether of 14 similar premises. In actual fact, there are 2 in Winchester, because just around the corner is 3 Joes, and that's effectively owned by the same people, and the 2 premises actually compete with each other because they are very similar in the nature of operation. But they both live happily next to each other and are both, fortunately, profitable. But the point is simply this, that with regard to other stable premises, we do have this risk assessed condition. It is generally accepted by other police forces around the place, and it solves the problem of having a rigid SIA condition when there may not be a need for it, and it is indeed enforceable. Town Watch is the next one. We propose that is on the existing licence, and I don't think that there is any difficulty. The police commented not including any pub wash conditions as they're reliant on a third party. Well, yes and no. If there is a pub watch scheme operating in the locality, then the premises are required to join it. And if the pub watch scheme disappears, and that is something that is beyond our control, well then obviously we don't have to be part of it. But as long as it's there, then you take part in it and you join in their initiatives. No conditions proposed under the general heading of public safety, because those were subsumed in other conditions. And then with regard to public nuisance, PC Swallow has quite properly asserted that's really a matter for environmental health noise officers. I did have correspondence with with the relevant officer during the consultation period, and as a consequence, no representation has been made by the responsible authority that looks after that aspect of it. And then moving on, protection of children from harm, we proposed a Challenge 25 policy. The police also proposed a Challenge 25 policy, but with rather longer wording. What I had was the one on the existing licence. Again, I'm not going to argue about that, perfectly happy to accept that. Similarly, with staff training, the police suggested a different form of wording, and we are perfectly happy to agree to that, say that although it adds to the burden on the premises, that the additional condition that written records of all training will be maintained. I think that's a matter for you. Of course, all of this is a matter for you, but it should be there. The police have also asked for an additional condition relating to having a policy on how the premises will deal with vulnerable people. That, I think, is something that one would normally see with regard to a nightclub. But again, it is a matter for you. If you think it's appropriate to attach such a condition to these premises, well, so be it. We're not going to waste any breath arguing about it. Then that takes me back, if I may, to page 3 of the supplementary agenda, which was the front page of my submission. And this really is the number one, because what we effectively said was, well, the premises should be food-led, and you should have substantial meals appropriate, at least from the time the premises open. So we said 2200 hours or 10 o'clock, happy to change that to 11 o'clock, or an hour before the intended closing time of the premises, whichever is earlier. Well, as I've indicated to you, they normally close at 11 o'clock at the moment, and the kitchen normally shuts at 10 o'clock. If for one reason or another, it is going to open beyond 12 o'clock, beyond 11 o'clock, then we're perfectly happy to change that to 2300 hours. The difficulty then comes with regard to the other conditions. That customers are shown to their table. Well, that would effectively mean that you have to have a member of staff permanently on duty at the door in order to escort people to a table. And I question why. You know, in an awful lot of food-led establishments, people just walk in, sit down and wait to be served, or go to the bar to place their order, etc. Substantial table meals prepared in the premises and served and consumed at the table using non-disposable crockery. Well, okay, that's fine. But no takeaway service of food or drink for immediate consumption is provided. Now, I believe, and I stand corrected if I'm wrong, that in the latest incarnation of the police proposed conditions, that particular one has disappeared, but it is in effect still there. Because it goes on to say, intoxicating liquor is only sold, supplied or consumed on the premises to persons who are bona fide customers supplied with substantial table meals. Well, this is a pizza restaurant, and a fair bit of the trade is either takeaway or even delivery, etc. And that is something that we would want to continue. Because if you go on, it asserts consumption of alcohol in the bar area is restricted to customers waiting to be escorted to a table. I confess that I don't entirely understand that. But the number of patrons drinking in the bar areas, moderated tables should not exceed 6 persons. Well, there's a bar area upstairs, there's a bar area downstairs as well. And then the crunch one, alcohol should only be sold or supplied to customers who are engaging in the sit-down table meal as an ancillary to that meal. Well, if a customer comes in wanting a takeaway, then they could not be supplied with alcohol at all because they've got to engage in the sit-down table meal and only have it as an ancillary to the meal. So if, for example, I were to go in with my family and my teenage kids or whatever, they're all chomping at the bit, wanting their pizza. I thank you very much. I'm not a great one at lunchtime for pizza or anything else comes to that, but I wouldn't mind having a drink whilst they eat. I can't be served with an alcoholic beverage because I'm not having a meal. The fact of the matter is that these premises operate really quite successfully at the moment, and as PC Swallow has been kind enough to assert in its representation, etc., they haven't caused any problems. There's not an issue with regard to it. So the question that I ask is, well, if it's not causing a problem, then why restrict it? This is not an application to review the existing licence. It's an application for granting a new licence. And it is also an application for granting a new licence in an area that is not the subject of any cumulative impact assessment or cumulative impact policy. PC Swallow comments that there are only 2 other venues that are licensed until the early hours of the morning. Both of them have recently apparently been subject to a review, but no evidence has been given as to why that was, what the outcome of it was, and or whether or not there is in fact any issue of crime and disorder in this locality. If there is, it's certainly not associated with these particular premises, and in all of the circumstances and as a matter of law, there is a presumption in favour of grant of a licence, having regard to the section N, the operating schedule of conditions proposed, subject to amendment, use in the light of any representations that are made by anybody at all. In this case, the only representation is with regard to the police. So what I'm therefore asking you to do, please, is to grant this application subject to the amendments to these conditions that we are perfectly happy to go along with, but no others, please. What happens if that is not acceptable? Well, we deliberately made an application for a new licence for the reasons that I've already told you about, and one other. And the one other is that we do have a licence that we can live with. We prefer not to live with it because of some of the conditions that are attached to it, but we can. And any new licence that you would grant, subject to the condition that it shall not come into effect until the existing licence is surrendered. If we weren't to surrender, the existing licence, then any licence that you might be kind enough to grant today would simply sit on the shelf gathering dust. The only minor problem that I then have is that I know that the plans attached to the existing licence are inaccurate because they do not show that servery that has been upstairs for we know idea how long, probably 4 or 5 years or more. The previous holders should have made an application to vary plans, but it appears that they never did. And so if that were the case, then I would need to make a further application with regard to the existing licence to get the plans corrected. I would be confident to make that a minor variation application because nobody has raised any issue with regard to the parking application that relates to the licence drawings. So there it is. I have to confess that I thought this was really a relatively simple and straightforward matter. It's become horrendously complicated, but the police are perfectly entitled to make their views known, and it is your decision. So, sir, I will leave it at that, with my apologies again that this was rather late in the day. I hope that you found it and find it of some assistance in coming to your decision.
Thank you very much. Councillor Baxter, do you have any questions?
Yeah. No, not immediately.
Councillor Cumming.
Thank you. Yes, I have one or two. But today, can you tell me, I haven't actually frequented the establishment in question, but could you tell me about upstairs a little bit more, the area where you're talking about the servery? Could you tell me what it is currently used for, its function? Is it used for private functions, or if it's just a servery area, or what?
Upstairs is laid out very much as downstairs is. So there are bench type tables that sit anything between two people, wooden tables with chairs. Upstairs there is some fixed bench seating as well, but there are tables for two, there are tables for four, there are then tables for six, and a couple of tables for eight. And upstairs, in terms of the tables and the chairs that go with them, is pretty well the same as downstairs. The biggest difference is that whereas downstairs there is the proper bar and the toilet is literally down a few steps. Upstairs is where the kitchen is, and that is an open area so that anybody who is sitting upstairs can watch the staff go about their business and cook, so on and so forth. That takes up a fair chunk of the upstairs area. But as you come up the stairs from the ground floor, they dog leg, and at the top of the stairs opposite you is a smaller bar servery, which is used to dispense drinks in pretty well exactly the same way as the one downstairs is.
Thank you. Is the upstairs used separately for functions later on after midnight at the moment?
Once in a blue moon is the reality of that. But I think you also have to bear in mind that these premises were acquired some 18 months ago. And of course, during the last 18 months, we have been pretty well in COVID, more or less throughout, with ranging from completely closed to only being able to do takeaway and things like that, to being totally open and along the way with restrictions, Rule of Six, and all of that sort of thing. So since Stable have, rather this company has owned it rather than Fuller's, there's only been one occasion where upstairs has been used. But as we come out of COVID and people start to socialise more, then one hopes that there would be a greater demand. Demand or need, I know, is not something that you should be concerned with, but to have that facility available would be very helpful, because there are, as PC Small has pointed out, very few venues in Winchester that have a licence to open late at night.
Very much. Thank you.
Right, I'm just trying to establish in my own mind, and maybe others as well, exactly how we see this establishment operating. From what you've said, I understand it will open about 11 o'clock during the day to serve lunchtime customers, both with possible takeouts as well as eating in, and opportunities for people to have a drink as well. And that will continue throughout the normal course of the day into the evening as well. And come around 10 o'clock, is all food serving going to stop? And so if people come in after being perhaps elsewhere to another establishment, wanting a pizza and a drink, are they going to be served a pizza and a drink at that time or not?
At the moment, no, because the kitchen closes at 10 o'clock. The premises basically shut at 11. It doesn't even operate to the full extent that most restaurants do, as I'm sure you're aware, under the old regime. Restaurants, sort of the pubs had to shut at 11 o'clock with 20 minutes drinking up time, or the bar shut 20 minutes drinking up time. Restaurants shut at midnight with 30 minutes drinking up time. At the moment, and again, this is demand-led, there is insufficient demand to justify keeping the premises open beyond 11 o'clock. The kitchen closes at 10 at the moment. As I said, on rare occasions you may get a couple of stragglers who haven't quite finished eating or whatever, who may be there for a little while beyond 11, but never beyond midnight, unless it's one of those very rare occasions where somebody has put down. It would generally be what it would be upstairs, so that downstairs continues to operate for members of the public and the like. Again, as one comes out of COVID restrictions and life in the city centres begins to pick up, it may well be that more people will come out and want to eat, after
That was the point I was coming on to say. Maybe things are going to change.
Well, one hopes so. That's why we want to maintain an element of flexibility.
And also, of course, then there might also be rather more private functions happening as well, I think.
Indeed, one hopes. I mean, try to think how many couples have had to put off their nuptials thanks to the dreaded COVID.
So we want these conditions that we want to put together to meet all those demands.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And if you have a nice, quiet, well-behaved group who want to, celebrate a wedding or a bar mitzvah or whatever it is beyond midnight, do we really need to be compelled to have door staff from 10 o'clock, which is what the existing condition says? And we say, well, no, but let's adopt a common sense approach and make it risk assessed and make it a requirement to risk assess. And similarly, one also has something benign for the future. The State Group have no intention of disposing of this property, but nothing lasts forever. And there is a possibility that at some point it may change hands. I think, according to Mr. Spratley, he thinks that it changed hands at least 3 times in his memory, whilst he was a teenager and so on, when it was owned by a nightclub. And it has then changed hands, about 18 months ago, because Fuller's turned it into the stable and then sold out to my client company. It's possible that it would change hands again, and what we're concerned to do is to ensure that there are conditions there, particularly the ones relating to being a food-led establishment and so on and so forth, that would prevent it simply turning straight back into a nightclub. I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, PC Swallow has the same intention, but I would respectfully submit that he's going further than is necessary, or indeed the appropriate word is appropriate.
All right, thank you very much. PC Swallow, would you like to introduce your representation, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes. On the 22nd of November 2021, the police received a new premises licence application for the stable restaurants in Winchester. This was strange as the venue already benefits from a premises licence and premises licence holder, and the DPS were to remain the same. The proposed changes that this application makes to the existing licence, in my opinion, could have been made on a minor variation, as Mr. Day has alluded to. However, the applicant has decided not to. I still can only assume that they either do not wish to jeopardise the existing licence or what's contained upon it. There's also a very distinct probability that I would have been minded to make a representation against such a minor variation. The authority would then, on receipt, decide to either grant or refuse the application with no right to appeal. I received no notice or prior communication regarding this application, as is suggested within the 182 guidance. As is a matter pertaining to crime and disorder, I'm somewhat concerned as to the reasons why. The application continued to cause concern on reading section M of the application, steps that the applicant will take to promote the 4 licensing objectives. The wordings for the proposed conditions were all very different from those on the existing licence, most pertinent of which being the removal of a security provision and being replaced with that of a risk assessment. However, the applicant intended to keep the late night offering hours, those timings being a terminal hour of 0100 on Monday through to Thursday and 0230 Thursday through to Saturday and midnight on the Sunday. The application states that the existing premises licence granted was when it was operating as a late night bar. This is true, it was. However, the applicant has failed to mention that when they acquired the venue back in 2015, they contacted the police to negotiate the removal of several conditions to tailor it to a restaurant. At the time, they wished to keep the late opening hours, as ultimately it adds value to the property, which I can certainly understand. To facilitate this, it was agreed that if the venue intended to operate past midnight, a security provision would kick in. That full variation, and not a new premises licence application, was not objected to and the varied licence issued. That licence has remained in place since that date. Now, everybody in the room is acutely aware of the impact that COVID-19 has had upon the hospitality industry for the last 2 years. Responsible authorities have worked tirelessly with the industry to help them through these difficult times, and this approach was fully supported by the government and outlined in the open letter from MP Kit Morehouse to local authorities. During these past 2 years, I have adopted this approach and I've facilitated several variations to premises licences across Hampshire, the majority of which involve amending security provisions. As firstly, their cost is very impractical on businesses, and secondly, there was and still is a lack of qualified door supervisors. At no time within the last 6 years, and more pertinently within the last 2 years, have the stable, its legal representatives or any person connected with the stable contacted Hampshire Constabulary to discuss amending their premises licence in any way until now. To be very transparent, the venue does not suffer from alcohol-related crime, disorder or antisocial behaviour. It is well run, and I confess having sampled their wares on more than one occasion. In contrast, Winchester City Council, not unlike any other vibrant city, does suffer from alcohol-related crime, disorder and antisocial behaviour, predominantly in the nighttime economy, and specifically on Fridays and Saturdays past midnight. As a committee, you will have seen that in recent months I have submitted two review applications for venues not more than 100 metres in each direction of the stable. This shows the level of crime disorder in the area. I would strongly suggest that one of the reasons the stable does not add to my nighttime economy crime statistics is that it does not currently operate past midnight. That is because it is a pizza restaurant and closes at a respectful time for a restaurant, and as such has no need for SIA door staff. The stable now wants its cake, or pizza in this case, and eat it. It wants to operate as a restaurant up to 2300 hours, whereby a full menu is available. However, from 2300 hours until its latest terminal of 0230, it will not offer food. At 2300, it must therefore become a bar, a late night bar, or even back to being a nightclub. Proposed licensable activities also include regulated entertainment, so this is a very plausible prospect. It will be a nighttime economy venue. In fact, it would only be behind Winchester's Vodka Bar nightclub and Alfie's Late Night Bar as the latest opening venue. To negate this from occurring on the 7th of December, I formally proposed conditions to support a restaurant operation. table service, restriction on vertical drinking, substantial table meals, etc. If these were agreed at the time, I would have been minded to remove any reference to FSIA security and retain the late term allowance. Other than a brief conversation with Mr. Day, their solicitor, the only formal communications I've had were received at 17:40 hours yesterday, just over 8 weeks since the application was submitted, which from an established national hospitality company I find extremely poor. If the committee considers that application, that conditions attached to the licence could alleviate their concerns, I provided copies of the conditions that I proposed on the 7th of December, 14 days after they submitted the application. During the consultation process for this application, for clarity, there is no reference to environmental conditions as environmental health are the lead agency on this. Mr. Day has made reference to 3 Joes, a very nearby premises that is operated by the same company. For clarity, Chair, this venue does not benefit from any SIA door staff condition, and certainly not one of a risk assessment, and that operation is still over 100. The Chief Officer of Police is satisfied that the application, if granted, as applied and unaltered, it would undermine the licensing objectives of prevention of crime, disorder, public safety and prevention of public nuisance. I thank the committee for their time, and I can assist in any way, please ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If you have questions, please do swallow, Chair. Now would be the time to ask them.
Mrs. Swallow.
Oh,
Sorry. Thank you very much. And I assume you've read this document that's been presented at the 23rd hour. What are your comments on this document? I mean, your comments have been rewritten or crossed out, or what are your feelings about that? What are your views?
Feelings. There's certainly some agreed conditions in there in relation to the CCTV refusals, logs, etc., etc. They're fine, but ultimately the contentious point is the removal of SIA security, which I don't agree with. If this venue is to operate up until 02:30 in the morning. If it intends to operate at 02:30 in the morning as a restaurant, then it needs to have formal restaurant conditions to support that, and formally and legally prevent it from operating as a late night bar, as nightclub. Mr. Day's proposals do not give that level of guarantee. As he said, as we all know, a premises licence is given to a building. It's not given to an applicant. This premises licence, if granted in an unaltered state, could change hands tomorrow. Winchester could have a third night as of tomorrow with a 2:30 operating condition, with no provision for security. This is what I'm trying to prevent. And if the applicant says, and they're a pizza restaurant, which I'm sure they are, then there should be no problem with them having conditions to support a restaurant. If there are certain circumstances where they wish to operate to the latest time, which is permitted on the licence, and that condition does cause them concern, there is also the possibility of applying for a temporary event notice. By doing so, that could override the condition. It would also come to myself as responsible authority and to environmental health. And we could ask that the committee could have conditions already on the premises licence be added to that temporary event notice, or it could be granted and permitted in its use. And we see that as a far much better way of dealing with this premises. The premises is operating fine as it is at the moment, as I've stated. So to receive this application and now those amended wordings you suggested doesn't fill me with a great deal of confidence. And I still believe that they wish to have that piece of it. It will operate as a bar past 2300. It must operate as a bar past 2300 hours. They've said that their kitchen will be turned off. It will be a bar. It will be a late night venue.
Just to follow on from that, I know your idea of temporary licences, which are possible, would it be sensible to limit the number of evenings when it could be used as a private functions? So at the moment it's once in a blue moon, which is very difficult to write down, but if it was limited to one a month or something, would that be sensible?
It could well do. That I would probably suggest it is a discussion for yourselves. The problem is that the premises licence already benefits from that, or this application is asking that late hour on a weekly, daily basis, so to speak, so 02:30 every Friday and Saturday. What you're potentially suggesting then would be to reduce that, but to only allow them to operate until those times for one weekend per month. That I could consider, and I would support that.
Thank you.
Councillor Cunningham.
Thank you, Chair. Once COVID has come and gone, hopefully, we will probably find that that it is basically an eclectic operation. It's a restaurant up until 11 o'clock in the evening, and after that it becomes a nighttime economy venue with all of the pluses and minuses that brings. Clearly, the border timing is 11 o'clock because that's the time that the pubs close. And of course, after that, people are on the streets looking for alternative venues. This would then become a venue of the nighttime economy at that point in time for people looking for another venue. What do you feel would be the solution to that problem in terms of protecting and promoting the objectives of the licensing authority?
With a 02:30 terminal hour and supply of alcohol in that location, it would become an end destination venue. So the vodka bar outfits as such. So you would get those from other establishments nearby, those that are closing at 11, 12 o'clock, who wish to continue consuming alcohol. They would go to the later part, as they do now, all over the country, and to continue consuming alcohol for the extra 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours in the nighttime economy is quite a long time. People can consume quite a lot of alcohol in that time. One of the things that we would pretty much always strongly consider in those circumstances is the use of SIA security. But that's your first line of defence. Firstly, preventing those who are already too intoxicated coming into the venue, and then also dealing with the subsequent issues of alcohol-related crime disorder and removing those from the venue. We can then go on to say, well, those SIA security staff should be in possession of body-worn video, etc., and other things that we would ask to potentially kick in. Scanning requirements that we have in some other venues around Hampshire, but most definitely SIA security and a number of security that would be suitable to manage the number of patrons within the venue.
Thank you. Mr. Day stated that they have security from 10 p.m. onwards if it's going to be open after midnight. Is that correct, or is it?
It's actually, sorry, that was my mistake. The existing condition, which is on page 42 of the back, says this: whenever the premises is open to conduct any licensed activities after midnight, they shall implement the following from 2100, not 2200, from 9 o'clock at night until the closing time of the venue. A ratio of 2 SIA registered door supervisors should be employed for the first 100 persons, and then 1 door supervisor per 100 persons thereafter. With the capacity of these premises, and I'm talking here about the number of covers, you're talking about somewhere in the region of 50 downstairs, maybe a couple more, 75 upstairs, you're up to 125 on that basis, that they would be required to have 3 SIA registered door staff from 9 o'clock at night. And effectively, what we say is that, given the nature of the premises, the sort of events we're talking about, that's disproportionate. Now, if you were minded to effectively do something along these lines, to play with other conditions. So at the moment, what I propose is, if it's intended the principle beyond midnight on any day, etc., then we carry out the risk assessment. What we could do is to effectively amend that to say that if they intend to stay open after midnight, then they do still have to carry out the risk assessment, but unless otherwise agreed by PC Swallow or his colleagues, they shall deploy door supervisors from, and I would suggest, either 11 o'clock or ideally from our point of view from midnight through till close, as determined by the risk assessment. They're subject to a minimum of 2, so that you've got 1 on the door, preventing the drunks from coming in from other establishments, and 1 within the venue, keeping an eye on things and assisting staff. I think that, I don't know what PC Swallow thinks of something like that, but the default position would be, if you're going to do that, you have to have the SIA, you can persuade the police because you've done your risk assessment, and it is a peaceful, quiet event, my retirement party or something, then you don't need the door supervisors. That might provide the solution. But if somebody wants a quiet private party upstairs to go on until 12:30, to then have to have 3 door supervisors on from 9 o'clock, as is required by the current condition, effectively means you're not going to do it because it's simply not cost effective.
So your position is that it would still be a risk assessment basis, but that the security would be from midnight onwards. Whereas what I was suggesting to you was that my concern is that without security, after 11 o'clock at night, when the pubs close, that's the crucial hour, isn't it?
Yeah, I wouldn't deny that. I mean, my office is in Bournemouth, and I know what Bournemouth is like on the old Christchurch Road at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't go anywhere near the place. But yes, without wishing to be flippant about it, that's fine. And if you think it's appropriate to then say, if you're going to be beyond midnight, then you have to have door staff on from 11 o'clock, unless the police agree that you don't need to. And it would only happen, the nature of this business is such that they are not interested in attracting people who have had a skinful somewhere else and want to carry on boozing. It's not a vertical drinking establishment, and it's a question of trying to strike a balance between the two. In terms of, it's suddenly operating as a nightclub. Well, that would not be a viable situation with the conditions that I have suggested, relating to it being principally operated as a restaurant, having to provide food until an hour before closing or whatever, and to have the waiter waitress service, and to suggest a minimum number of covers, and in that sense, knowing the premises as I do, I would suggest it a minimum of 40. I wouldn't want it to be 70 or 80 or something like that, because that would mean that we'd have to keep the first floor open in order to provide any number of covers when circumstances might not justify it. I mean, you could even go so far as to say, okay, you provide a minimum number of covers on the ground floor at all times. And if you open the first floor, then you have to provide a minimum number of covers up there as well. By covers, I mean a table and chair place for somebody to sit down and eat if they choose to do so. That's another possibility.
Can I just mention a point that I think to clarify something that I think is a little bit confusion. Mr. Day is talking about, has said there a little bit about the covers and indicating 40 or 50. But we already know that the restaurant and the kitchens are going to close at 2300 hours. So there won't be any covers. There are tables and chairs, yes, granted, but there are no covers. There is nobody eating food past this time. That number then goes up from 40 to 50. I would suggest that you start getting into the realms of fire safety, but I would suggest that venue could hold at least 250, 300 people. And that's the numbers that I'm looking at. They're not fixed seating, so there are some fixed seating, but that would allow vertical drinking. And as we already know, there is no food being offered past 2300 hours. I wanted to clarify.
Thank you. Right, the applicant and premises licence holder may address the subcommittee in order to clarify any points or issues raised in representation.
A licence is a licence. It's permission to do something. If I can give a slightly silly analogy, I've got a driving licence. If I choose to go somewhere by train, I'm perfectly entitled to do that. I don't have to use it. And the reality of the situation is that these operators do not use this licence to its full extent. A condition is something that you have to do, but it doesn't restrict you. So yes, the kitchen closes at 10 o'clock at the moment, for reasons that you're very well aware of. However, if demand requires it, then there is absolutely no reason at all why that kitchen cannot stay open for significantly longer than the minimum time that is currently proposed. You know, an hour before close. 2300 hours or an hour before close is a slight change that we're perfectly happy to accept. But that's not the same as saying or having a condition that says the kitchen will close at whatever time it is. It can stay open and continue if needs must. The fact of the matter is that if somebody wants to have some sort of function there that goes on until 1:30 or 2 o'clock, how often do people actually go out to eat after midnight? It doesn't happen very often, certainly not the sort of establishment that we're talking about here. As you said at the very outset, Chair, it's meant to be a discussion. These hearings, committee meetings, I would hope that having put forward some other suggestions by way of compromise, having heard what PC Swallow has to say in his concerns, that we can reach a happy medium here. And as I suggested a few minutes ago, I don't intend to repeat myself, but I just want to address another thing that has come up with PC Swallow with regard to this idea of submitting temporary amendments. The problem with that is that if somebody, police or environmental health, serves a counter notice applying the conditions on the licence, there's nothing you can do about it, and that's part of the problem. And having to do that every time is problematic. It's time consuming. It's okay, the fee is £21, but it is time consuming and it restricts flexibility, and there is a risk attached. And if objection notice is given, then you end up having hearings every time. It is simply not financially viable, and it causes a huge amount of inconvenience for committees having to arrange hearings at short notice. 10 standard 10 working days notice. If you do that, then you have to convene the hearing 48 hours before the start of the event. Later than that, and that's problematic at the best of times. So that's not a solution that we find particularly attractive. So, I don't think there's anything else I can usefully add, unless you have further questions.
Just to clarify one bit, I don't think we need to sit as a committee for the pretend license, do we? Necessarily.
Only if an objection is raised.
Only
In environments with alcohol.
But under normal circumstances, we wouldn't.
Not unless there's an objection.
I can see there are two scenarios here. There are, as we are at the moment without COVID restrictions and so on, we're probably not faced by too many late nights with people staying on, but that is likely to increase. And once it happens one weekend, it will happen another weekend, and will perhaps become the norm. That may be good for business, of course. The alternative is sometimes you'll get these once in a blue moon events, hopefully be more frequent of those. So we've got these two contrasting situations where you're going to have late nights. Some may lead to crime disorder, others may not. I'm just wondering if it's possible for us to try to restrict the number of late night openings in any way. So I have to ask that question, because if we go away and decide it's...
At the end of the day, it's a matter for the committee to decide what's appropriate in these circumstances. I would, however, remind you, not that you need to be reminded, that if it transpires that you grant the licenses as we ask, and it then turns out that it has become a destination for people who want to carry on drinking, beyond midnight and all the rest of it. And that causes issues or problems. Then, as PC Swallow has already alluded to, I know nothing about circumstances. He's already got 2 reviews of the premises. I don't know why, I don't know what the outcome was. You're probably better placed to know that than I am, not being a local boy. But there'd be nothing to prevent him, prevent anybody else seeking a review of the licence. I would rather hope that if there was a problem, that there would be a dialogue between whoever raises the issue and the premises, see if it could be resolved informally. But there is always rigidity hanging over any licensed premises for review, which, if justified, you could end up having your licence completely and utterly revoked. And that's one other thing that we're not trying to do here, essentially. I'm sure you'll have heard of shadow licenses, where a landlord applies for exactly the same licence as his tenant or lessee has, so that if they muck it up and their licence gets revoked, there's another licence sitting there, which can immediately come back into action. There is no basis on which we would have 2 concurrent licenses sitting here, one as insurance against loss of the other. We could only use the new licence, could only use it if we were to surrender the existing licence. And similarly, if we didn't surrender the existing licence, we couldn't use a new one. It's as simple and straightforward as that.
Thank you.
The subcommittee will retire to consider the application in private, with only the head of legal services representative and committee administrator in attendance. The The committee will reach its determination and notify the applicant of the decision in accordance with the Regulation 26 to 29 of the Licensing Act 2003. Thank you.
That says
yesterday, where the committee decided that they would let us know within 5 working days. But I take it it's your intention to make a decision today.
I'll make a decision.
Right, thank you.
In reaching its decision, the subcommittee has carefully considered the application, the representation made by responsible authorities and other persons, and the applicant's evidence given today. It has taken into account the Council's statement of licensing policy, the Home Office guidance issued under Section 182 of the Licensing Act 2003, the duties under the Crime and Disorder Act 1998, and the rights set out in the Human Rights Act of 1998. The subcommittee has concluded that the application be granted subject to conditions in accordance with the operating schedule, modified to such extent as the authority considers appropriate for the promotion of the licence objective, as detailed below, and the mandatory conditions. Approved plan submitted with the application. Amended the hours for recorded music to finish at 1 AM, Monday to Wednesday. In order to save reading out the conditions in full, summarised as follows. All parties will receive the wording in full following this meeting. CCTV. The wording supplied by the police as agreed by the applicant. Refusals log. The applicant's amended wording submitted on the 19th of January 2022. Restaurant. The applicant's wording submitted on the 19th of January 2022, removing the comments. Challenge 25, the wording supplied by the police as agreed by the applicant. Training. The police conditions as amended by the applicant on the 19th of January 2022. Vulnerability. Wording from the police as agreed by the applicant. Pub watch, as per the original application 22nd of November 2021. SIA security. If the premises are to be open after midnight on any day of the week, the premises licence holder shall ensure that the minimum of 2 licensed SIA door supervisors are employed for the first 100 persons, and then 1 door supervisor per 100 persons thereafter. They shall be on duty at the premises from 10 PM until the time when, 10:30 PM until the time when licensable activities cease. This number is to include 1 frontline door supervisor. This number is to include only front line door supervisors, SIA staff employed solely on door supervisor security duties, i.e. safety and security at the venue. Premises licence holder may be exempted from the requirement to employ a minimum of 2 licensed SIA door supervisors at the premises on the above mentioned occasions when written consent is obtained from the authorised officer of Hampshire Constabulary's Police Licensing Department at least 7 days in advance of any such occasion. Other undisputed conditions proposed by the applicant. The licence shall be of no effect unless and until premises licence number Prem 196 is surrendered. If it is intended to provide any form of live music, live or recorded music as regulated entertainment other than in accordance with the Live Music Act as amended, i.e. after 2300 hours, the holder of the licence will have in place a written noise management plan to ensure that neighbouring properties will not suffer from a noise nuisance. Undertake monitoring of noise levels outside the premises at least every 30 minutes to ensure that noise levels are not causing nuisance to the occupiers of any residential properties in the locality. Ensure that all amplified music is routed through a noise limited device calibrated to the reasonable satisfaction of the licensing authority. If the premises are open beyond midnight, the admission of new patrons will not be permitted after 01:30 hours. The holder of the licence shall ensure that noise and odours from the premises are controlled in such a way as not to cause a public nuisance. A notice shall be prominently displayed at the exits from the premises requesting that patrons leave quietly. Going on to our reasons. Due to the easing of the restrictions imposed during the coronavirus pandemic, the general public are going to increase attendance at licensed premises such as the Stables, 31B, the Square, Winchester, during nighttime economy hours. These are considered to be reasonable and proportionate measures necessary to promote the licensing objectives of prevention of crime and disorder, public safety, and prevention of public nuisance. Not to do so would undermine those objectives. All parties will be formally notified of the decision in writing shortly. This notification will include details of the right to appeal against this decision to the Magistrates Court, which must be made within 21 days of the notification. And that concludes our meeting today. Thank you.
And thank you, sir, on behalf of the stable, and, Mr. Spatley, for your kind attention and courtesy to us today. It's much appreciated.